Hi everyone, we are looking at our Module 12 this week. I can't believe it. We are so close to Thanksgiving break. I am sure that you all are really looking forward to that, and I hope you noted on my course schedule that there is nothing for you to do in this class during your Thanksgiving break. Get some rest. We have a total of 3, including this one, content-related modules left before the end of the semester. Which I think it's just going to fly by, although you do have a good amount of assignments still due. So looking ahead, we have just one single discussion post for this particular week, and then you've got a bonus discussion during the first week of December, which is great. But then you also have, more importantly, your final baseline video that's due right before finals open, and another reflective paper the week after your break. So still a good amount of points to come. I have been doing these live Zoom /Zoom recordings in the research class that I think people have found to be useful, and so I was thinking about doing the same thing for this course towards the end of the semester to prepare for your final exam. Exams can be anxiety provoking for many people, and I completely understand that and acknowledge it. The exam is not that I'm offering is not meant to trick any of you. It is, a basic review of all of the foundational micro skills that you've been focusing on throughout the semester. How to use certain skills, when to use them, the best and worst way to use those skills. And it's not a lengthy exam either. So I think we could probably do a pretty quick and simple Q&A / review before the final, and hopefully that will help all of you. So please watch out for an email from me. I'll try to get that scheduled sooner than later. And again, for those of you especially that are in the 680 class, you know that I record them and I post them. If you have questions, you can send them to me before and I'll address them in the actual recording. So with that being said, we are kind of switching gears here towards the end of the semester, and I do this in preparation for 606. For those of you who have me, fantastic. If not, that's completely fine. No personal offense taken on that. There are a couple different groups again. So I really want, we've learned up until this point a number of different micro skills, right? We've learned and practiced how to interview, how to speak with somebody, how to listen, how to reflect, how to paraphrase and summarize, how to ask questions in the right way, how to gauge emotion, how to probe and dig deeper into somebody's story and their restory. So now we're going to be thinking about how to use these skills in these last couple weeks of the semester, how to use these skills with populations that are very specific to who we might be seeing in our practice. And I do this because there's another textbook that I've used in the past, but this year, and they just sent me an email about it. They just updated it. It's specific to counseling theories that would apply to rehabilitation counselors. It's counseling theories and techniques for rehabilitation counselors is a textbook. And I've used it in my 606 class before, and I really like it because in the traditional vocational rehabilitation world, and some of you may find if you're going into that particular setting, there, up until recently, really was not as much of an emphasis on the counseling aspect of the work that was being done in voc rehab. Not that there was not counseling being done, and not that those individuals that were deemed counselors and had counseling degrees were not conducting counseling or were not effective counselors. But I have always thought that it's interesting that we talk about all these theories and application of theory to individuals by and large with mental health impairments, but we really don't put a lot of attention and focus on how these theories and techniques can be applied to individuals that have dual diagnoses. Maybe somebody has a physical disability, and that's what we're learning about this week, and honestly, in a lot of the theories books, there's either like a little blurb at the end of each theory chapter on how to apply that particular theory to individuals with physical disabilities, or it's just left to like a last chapter, more of like what I feel is like an afterthought. And you are taking a class, of course, for the addictions class, where you're going to be really specifically talking about working with individuals with substance use disorders. But I do want you to think about specific theoretical application in working with those populations, because there tend to be, and I'll go back to voc rehab because that's, my background is specifically in rehab counseling. Motivational interviewing and solution-focused counseling and reality therapy were always the go-to in VR counseling. And you see a lot of similarities in terms of using specific counseling techniques and theories depending on the population that somebody might be working with. And honestly, some counseling theories were developed to work and be effective specifically with individuals that have a specific diagnosis. Again, not that there is anything wrong with that, but I really like to take your understanding and conceptualization of how these theories could apply and can apply to individuals from a vast variety of populations. And I like to start you thinking about that now. And we'll get more into it in 606, of course. So this week we are talking about working with and providing counseling to individuals with physical disabilities. So when I'm talking about physical disability, again, I think there's a lot of overlap and intersectionality between disability status, or an individual identifying as somebody with a disability that has maybe a physical disability, but also has a mental health impairment, and then identifies with a number of other minority descriptors. So when I'm talking about physical disabilities, though I do put in the second slide of my PowerPoint a list of types of disabilities, this is not all inclusive by any means. And our understanding of what disability might look like or how it might progress really is ever evolving. But these types of disabilities that I've listed are some of the more common ones that you might see. And again, if you are working in a mental health focused agency and organization, it is not that you're not going to be seeing clients that have also these types of physical disabilities. The most common combination that I ever saw in my work as a rehabilitation counselor was back pain and depression. It was like you had both of them, and which came first, the chicken or the egg? So there's a very high likelihood that even if you think that you're going to be working specifically and solely with individuals that, you're picking a diagnosis out of the DSM-5 or 6 or 7 or whatever it is at that point in your career, this is why I like that addressing model as well, because you cannot ignore, if there's a physical disability present, you cannot ignore that as part of the overall picture of who your client is. And that's, I guess, the main point that I'm trying to achieve with this particular module. So are there specific theories that individuals who counsel people with physical disabilities always use? There are some that have been used more often, okay? So I talked about in vocational counseling, solution-focused brief counseling, positive psychology is another one. A lot of the theories that we've seen that have the greatest impact, positive impact, when working with people with physical disabilities are the ones that really focus on strengths. Very strength-based, motivational, what can you do types of theories, and addressing different thought patterns and belief systems, and that's where we see CBT and REBT come into play, because especially for individuals that have acquired a disability later in life, there's an adjustment that looks different than if somebody were born with a physical disability. So if we talk about adjustment to disability, we have to talk, and I know I always preach about using up-to-date resources, but sometimes we have to go back to our roots with how we understand and conceptualize theory and application of theory. So we're talking about Beatrice Wright, who talked about and this is not the medical model, right? So you've learned about the medical model to disability, of disability in the 600 class, and you'll continue to hear about it. But at a certain point, when we started to understand that there was the ecological model of disability and the humanistic perspectives. So we're talking about an individual with a disability adjusting and coping and adapting to a disability versus succumbing, okay? And so and this is where I get really hyper focused on language when you're writing about disability, that we're not talking about people in those victim type terms, that where somebody is suffering, when they're unable to do things, when they are afflicted with, people do still use that type of terminology. I mean, you still hear it on news, on the news and in, blogs or whatever it might be that you're reading, where somebody is quote unquote wheelchair bound, right? Those are all, in our day and age, I think we can very comfortably say that those are derogatory terms that are used to describe people with physical disabilities that by and large place them in the other category or the less than category, in the same way that other terms are used to describe other individuals of different categories. So we're talking about, in terms of adjustment to disability, again, we're focusing on the positive aspects, what somebody is able to do, what qualities they currently possess, what goals they have. And there's not always this required mourning period for individuals with disability. And there's been a good amount of literature on adjustment to disability and coping mechanisms and resiliency when it comes to later onset disability. And there are a number of different things that play into that. Spirituality is one of them. Absence of supports obviously would be on the other side of everything. Greater difficulty adjusting to disability if there's an absence or lack of supports, lack of education around what somebody is able to do, resources, things like that. Age kind of plays into it in some cases as well. But kind of this there's always been this misconception from individuals without disabilities, able-bodied people, that people with disabilities have to mourn a loss of something at some point in their lives. And some people do, but that is not always the case. And the process of adjusting to a disability is a lifelong process as well. Just like any other individual, if you have a child that is born with a disability, is a person currently without a physical disability, I always say currently because it could change today, I might think, well, at some point that child has thought of something they're not able to do and maybe had a mourning period, right? That I'm looking at that's not me speaking, that's just me hypothesizing as somebody else without a disability. And that's not the case. Or not, that's not always the case. It might be, but it is not our position to put that on a client with a physical disability. We are not there to assume or presume that there has been that period of loss or mourning in their lives. That could be a probing type question that we ask, an open-minded way to see how an individual has thought of or perceived their disability throughout their years. It may be that there were certain periods of time, adolescence, when every kid's like, the worst person in the world, in middle school, and just horrible to each other. Maybe there was a period of time where it was more difficult for that individual to adapt to their situation or to feel accepted by their peers. But that adjustment to disability and mourning, there's never like that automatic, always present period of mourning loss is not across the board for individuals with disabilities. Coping in terms of individuals with physical disabilities, again, really the emphasis should always be on what somebody can do. And especially in the vocational rehab counseling world, I always found that this was a difficult helping a client change that mindset of what they could not do to what they still could do was always a bit of a challenge depending on the background of the individual. And I'll give an example. So, a lot of the individuals I work with when I worked at Cigna, the insurance company, had spent a great deal of time fighting with Social Security disability to get on SSDI. We hear horror stories about it. If you don't have an attorney, you're never going to get it. The process can take years. You're going to be, rejected a couple of times and go into massive amounts of debt. It is, and I think still it was, and I think still is, a difficult process for people to get through. But during that period of time that somebody is attempting to apply for Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, you have to continuously tell people in positions of authority who are making decisions about your financial well-being, you have to consistently and persistently tell them what you are not able to do, that you cannot work, that you cannot do these things that other individuals may be able to do. And you have to do that to justify the need for SSDI. And then all of a sudden, when they would come to me, I was the one saying, okay, well, you have been approved for SSDI, but now you're working with me, and let's talk about the things you can do. And by the way, I think you can go back to work. And so shifting that mindset when somebody has been so ingrained and so involved in trying to convey to the outside world what they are not able to do and that they need assistance because of it, shifting that mindset can be very, it can be time consuming, but in a good way. That's where the counseling skills come out, right? So you're gonna have individuals that come to you and say, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this. Any individual, anybody seeking counseling services is there for a particular reason. They're likely not coming to see you because they feel that they can do everything on their own, right? They're there for some type of support. So I think the coping aspect of working with people with disabilities is something that you see across the board. But again, we're looking at the person as an active participant in that process. We cannot force somebody to change a mindset in a short amount of time if they're not ready to do that, if they're not mentally ready to do that. There may be an acknowledgement to a degree of what somebody is not able to do in a process of discussing that. But the goal is not to be working towards a cure or quote unquote fixing somebody. Again, that's along those lines of the medical model. So, there should be an acknowledgement of the things that have occurred and acknowledgement of the difficulties that still exist for that individual, but not an overemphasis on the cannots in their life. So again, talking about Beatrice Wright, going back to 83 here, it's a long time ago, but this adjustment process is that one of those foundational pieces of literature. So when we're talking about adjustment, we're thinking about when that individual is focusing on things other than their disability, other than the things that they are not able to do. There may be a shift or a change in the degree of importance of physical appearance and ability within that individual. When I say limits the disability to the actual impact of the impairment, that would be somebody that, again, has a later onset type of physical disability. And there's a difference, and you're learning this in 600, between those terminologies, right? Between the term impairment versus handicap, and environmental handicaps versus sociological impairment, right? So there are differences in how an individual's disability impacts their ability to do things depending on what thing we're talking about them doing. An individual may not be experiencing limitations in their own home setting because their home setting has been adapted to fit them, to fit their own particular needs. So it may be that somebody has those barriers to employment, and it's not because of things that they have done, it's because of the barriers that exist in the facility, for example. And again, we're placing values on the assets, the positive aspects, and this is where positive psychology really translates really nicely into working with people with physical disabilities, because we're talking about, again, strength-based approaches to working with somebody. Within these next couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking about accessibility, and when I talk about accessibility, I'm really focusing on actual physical access to the services that you're providing as a counselor. And so even if, again, even if you are really set, if you know for sure, I'm going to just, in 15 years when I have my LPC and my ALPS, I'm going to be opening up my own private practice. These things still apply in terms of accessibility. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about transportation. Are you accessible in terms of people physically getting to your office to get an appointment? And I'm here in Morgantown. I know that within the city limits, there's transportation. You get a little bit outside the city limits, transportation gets pretty limited. You get further out into the far corners of our county, and you're really looking at very limited, if not no access to public transportation. And so those are things to consider, especially for those of you that are living in rural populations, living in rural areas, and you're wanting to serve those rural populations. And I think the explosion of telemental health because of COVID, that one single silver lining maybe to all of it, is that now we're seeing greater access to services, because in cases where transportation is an issue and is a barrier to accessing services, it may be that somebody can connect virtually. Physical access, so if a person can get to your facility, can they get into it? There was one time I was thinking about doing some clinical work at an older office, and the building itself was on like the historical register, and so you can't just make modifications to those buildings. You can't just tear down front steps. You have to figure out alternatives. And one of the biggest issues that I had with that facility was that there was not a ramp, there was no ramp access, and there was not a back door. It was like one of those buildings in a downtown area that was completely surrounded except for the front door. And at the time when I asked about it, they had not ever their response was, well, we've never had a client with a physical disability or who was a wheelchair user that needed to come into our building. My counter to that was, well, maybe you would have, but they looked at the building and didn't think they could get in. And so these are things just to consider. Again, accessing your office. Are there only stairs to get to your actual office? Are there lifts? Is it well lit for individuals with vision impairments? Sometimes there might be policies in place. I see that a lot with animals, and so a building or facility might say, no pets in the building. And if you're renting out office space, and you have a client that comes in and uses a service dog, maybe the building owner would look at that individual and say, you can't access this facility. And so that's where our advocacy type work comes in, and we would be advocating for that client and explaining to the building owner, this is not a pet of an individual, this is a service dog, and for that reason, that particular no pet policy does not apply. So accessing an office and accessing a building space isn't just limited to physical barriers, but it may be, other policy issues that come into play that you might have to think about addressing. Documentation. You will find that a lot of the documentation now is electronic. You want to make sure that those forms are accessible or could be made, you could have a digital copy if you traditionally use paper copies of documentation. That would be allowing forms to be completed in some type of alternative format. Offering to complete a form for a client is a potential accommodation for providing services to an individual with a physical disability. I don't think it should be the first route. I think that while you could complete documentation for a client, and it may be that they would say yes to that. I've always felt that it would take away a bit of independence from that individual. And if you have those other alternatives where they could be completing the forms independently, if it just took a little bit of work from the side of the counselor to make those forms accessible, keeping the client's autonomy in the highest regard, and ability to be independent in all aspects of their counseling experience, I think is the best thing to do. So that wraps up my talk about providing counseling to individuals with physical disabilities. Because we have really moved through the textbook, I have a number of supplemental readings for you, special topic readings. I tried to update them. Actually, they were a little bit out of date, and so the articles that are up there now are relatively new. It is a bit difficult to find documents, to find quality research and literature about providing counseling services to individuals with physical disabilities. And again, I think a lot of that boils down to access and the barriers that exist for individuals with physical disabilities who may be desiring or need to see a mental health provider. But nevertheless, I think the articles I found were good, and I hope you enjoy them. And I'll jump back in during the discussion board. Hope you all have a great day.